On a remote outpost at the edge of the Galactic Academy's influence, a starship breached the atmosphere of the training world. A planet swathed in clouds, with violent storms that lashed its surface. The place had been chosen as the final frontier for the toughest and most elite cadets to train. It was the crucible where legends were born. From the darkened hull of the shuttle, the harsh winds howled like a beast roaring, eager to challenge the newcomer. Inside the shuttle's bay, a single figure stood, gazing out of a small viewport as the ship descended. His name was Kale T-Rax, a cadet hailing from a planet known across the galaxy for being one of the deadliest places in the universe, Raga, a Deathworld. The people of Raga had evolved in an environment of constant peril. Towering, carnivorous fauna with intelligence far beyond the average sentient species, and a planet-wide predator ecosystem that required every Ragan to be a soldier from birth. Kale's family was no exception. They were warriors, hunters, survivors trained to face danger at every turn. Kale had come to the Galactic Academy not as a hopeful dreamer but as a young man with a single goal: to prove that even in a galaxy filled with species from planets far more civilized than Raga, a Deathworlder could rise to the top. The shuttle's engines flared as it touched down on the landing pad, shaking Kale out of his thoughts. The doors hissed open, revealing the unforgiving landscape outside. He stepped onto the landing ramp, the wind assaulting him, but he barely flinched. He had spent the early years of his life in environments far harsher than this. His dark brown skin, adapted to extreme heat and wild elements, was a badge of honor in the galactic community. He was a Ragan, a Deathworlder, and no amount of storm or artificial challenge would break him. The first person to greet Kale on the landing pad was an officer from the Academy, a tall, willowy figure with an intimidating gaze and a dignified posture. This was Cadet Instructor Urilla, a graduate of the Academy with the prestigious rank of Major, renowned for her fierce intellect and tactical genius. "You're from Raga?" she asked, her voice measured, as though she had heard rumors and wasn't entirely convinced of them. "I am," Kale replied evenly, eyes scanning the Academy grounds. It was a sprawling complex built to withstand the planet's violent climate. But he already knew it wouldn't be the planet that would be his true challenge, it would be his peers, the elite of the galaxy. Urilla nodded, stepping aside as she gestured to the wide complex before them. "Then you already know what it means to survive. But the Academy is a different kind of survival. Here, we thrive by mastering the mind as much as the body. We rely on tactics, strategy, and teamwork. It's not just strength that wins wars, it's wit." Kale's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles. He had faced far more dangerous things than any of the galaxy's finest could throw at him. In truth, he'd been looking forward to this challenge more than any other in his life. Chapter 2: The Trials Begin. The first few weeks at the Galactic Academy were brutal. Every cadet who entered the Academy faced a series of trials, designed to test their endurance, intelligence, and adaptability. For some, these trials were nothing more than a mere formality. For others, they were life-altering. Kale had no illusions about what would happen during these trials. He'd studied the records, listened to the stories, and heard the rumors. He knew the challenges would be fierce. But nothing could prepare him for the intensity of the Academy's rigorous testing. The first trial was the Endurance Gauntlet, a simulation of planetary survival in hostile environments. The cadets were dropped onto a planet's surface with nothing but their wits and a few basic survival tools. The objective was simple: survive for 5 days. However, the planet itself was anything but. Kale stepped out of the drop pod onto an alien world that seemed determined to kill him at every turn. The air was thick and stifling, the ground beneath him soft and treacherous. Alien creatures stalked the horizon, their glowing eyes peering from the shadows. The first challenge was a pack of six-legged predators that seemed to have an almost symbiotic relationship with the planet itself. They attacked in unison, their sleek, black bodies darting between the trees with blinding speed. To the untrained, these creatures were nothing short of deadly. But to Kale, they were no different from the predators that roamed Raga's wilderness. He reacted instinctively, moving faster than any of his fellow cadets. With a swift maneuver, Kale dispatched the creatures one by one. He didn't kill them all. The creatures were just a test, and Kale's mind had already begun to race ahead. He had to outlast the trial, not just survive it. By the time the first day passed, Kale had already constructed a shelter, made a fire, and gathered supplies, things that would have taken most other cadets days to learn. As the sun began to set, his competitors were struggling to make it through the harsh conditions. Some were failing, others were injured, but Kale was thriving. His mind worked as sharply as his reflexes, and within the first 3 days, he had completed all the objectives of the trial with ease. But it wasn't the physical prowess that set him apart. It was his ability to think under pressure, his capacity for adaptation in the most adverse environments. The faculty watched in astonishment as Kale calmly navigated the brutal gauntlet, seeing each challenge as an opportunity rather than a threat. When the trial ended, Kale was one of only a few cadets still standing. Some had been forced to withdraw due to injury or failure. The rest stood in awe as Kale calmly strode to the finish line, his face impassive. Urla, standing at the finish line, couldn't help but nod in approval. "Impressive," she said, though her voice was more calculating than congratulatory. But this was only the first test. There are many more to come. Chapter 3: Battle for the Top. The days that followed were a blur of intense training, simulations, and drills. Kale quickly became a figure to be reckoned with. His prowess in combat was unparalleled, his strategic mind always one step ahead of his peers. But despite his success, not all of his fellow cadets were happy to see him excel. Whispers began to spread. Jealousy simmered beneath the surface, particularly among those who had always been the top of their class. They were used to being the best, and Kale's rise was seen as an affront to their dominance. During the tactical convergence, a live fire war simulation between two opposing cadet teams, Kale's team was pitted against the best and brightest the Academy had to offer. His squad was mismatched, composed of cadets from different species, each with different strengths and weaknesses. But Kale didn't see that as a hindrance. He saw it as an opportunity to build something greater. His leadership skills were put to the test as the battle raged on. Tactical strategies, battlefield control, and morale were all on the line. As Kale led his team, it became clear to everyone around him that his mind wasn't just quick, it was revolutionary. He saw every piece of the battlefield as part of a larger puzzle, using the environment itself to his advantage. The enemy cadets, led by the arrogant cadet Captain Alaris, underestimated Kale at every turn. But by the time the final hours of the simulation arrived, it was Kale's team that had decimated the opposition. The sheer tactical brilliance Kale displayed was beyond anything they had anticipated. His victory wasn't just a triumph of strength, it was a statement. When the simulation ended and the results were tallied, Kale stood victorious, his team scattered across the battlefield but united by their trust in him. Alaris, humiliated, limped away, his pride shattered. Chapter 4: The Trial of Unity. Not all of Kale's challenges were based on individual prowess. The Academy recognized that teamwork was equally important, and the final trial was known as the Trial of Unity. Cadets were placed into mixed teams, tasked with a mission that required them to rely on each other's strengths. The mission was simple on the surface: infiltrate a fortified installation, retrieve vital intelligence, and exfiltrate without being detected. The catch? The fortress was heavily guarded by a formidable AI system designed to neutralize intruders within minutes of detection. Kale and his new team, a mixture of beings from across the galaxy, each with their own skills and backgrounds, had to coordinate and communicate with precision to succeed. The trial pushed every cadet to their limits, but for Kale, it was an opportunity to show that his leadership wasn't just about tactics. It was about trust. His team, made up of species that didn't always get along, learned to work together under Kale's guidance. They fought side by side, overcoming their differences and learning to appreciate each other's unique skills. Kale's natural charisma shone as he united them under a common goal. By the time the mission was completed, the team had not only succeeded but had done so with a level of efficiency and synergy that was unprecedented. Kale's reputation as a leader had now transcended beyond just his individual talents. He had proven that even in a galaxy of infinite species and cultures, unity was possible. Chapter 5. The Legend is Born. When Kale T-Rex graduated from the Galactic Academy, he did so with a distinction that no one had ever seen before. His name was known throughout the galaxy not just as a survivor, but as a tactician, a leader, and a symbol of what could be achieved when one's will was stronger than the odds. His story didn't end with graduation. It was only the beginning. Kale's legacy would stretch across the stars, his reputation as a legend etched into the annals of history. But as the years passed, Kale T-Rex, the Deathworlder cadet who had become a legend, never forgot where he came from. And when the galaxy called on him again for the greatest threats to peace and order, the legend that was Kale T-Rex rose once more, not as a soldier of war, but as a beacon of hope for all who sought to survive and thrive in the endless expanse of the universe. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. Kale's rise through the ranks was swift, but peace in the galaxy had always been fragile. As Kale took on higher-ranking positions, he quickly realized that the galaxy was not as united as it appeared. The stars held more than just the ideals of progress. Dark forces lingered, hidden in the shadows. A secret war had been simmering beneath the surface of the galaxy's political landscape, one that would test Kale's loyalty to the very academy that had shaped him. It started with whispers in the darkest corners of the galaxy. A faction, a covert organization, began targeting key leaders within the academy. They called themselves the Silent Dominion, an underground movement of military elites and shadowy figures who believed in an iron-handed rule over the galaxy. They saw the academy and its ideals of unity and cooperation as weaknesses that needed to be eradicated. As Kale began to hear rumors of these operations, his mind instinctively turned to strategy. The Silent Dominion wasn't a threat to be underestimated. They had agents everywhere within the academy, within the governing bodies of the galaxy, and even inside the military. In truth, Kale had never been one to trust easily, but this was something different. This was a full-blown conspiracy. He started his own investigation, diving deep into intelligence reports, cryptic transmissions, and even speaking to old comrades from his days as a cadet. What he found was worse than anyone had imagined. The Dominion had infiltrated the academy itself, and soon they would make their move. His eyes narrowed as he realized that the first wave of their operation had already begun. The entire galaxy would be at war, and the Galactic Academy, the very institution that had forged him, would become the battleground. Chapter 7. A War Within the Academy. Kale's first action was to inform the Academy's leaders, those who were still loyal to the cause of peace, but their response was slow and fragmented. The Academy was not prepared for such an internal threat, not from an organization that had been working in the shadows for so long. It wasn't long before Kale's worst fears were realized. On a cold, gray morning, a series of coordinated attacks struck the Academy. Cadet instructors, high-ranking officials, and even students loyal to the old ideals were suddenly under siege. The Silent Dominion had infiltrated the very heart of the Academy. The halls that had once been a place of learning now rang with the sounds of gunfire. As chaos spread, Kale mobilized his old comrades, those from his trials, his mentors, and even some former adversaries. His legendary ability to unite people, regardless of their backgrounds, became his greatest weapon. Even those who had once looked down on him as an outsider now saw the brilliance of his leadership. The cadets fought back fiercely under Kale's command. The Dominion, though skilled, underestimated the tenacity of the survivors that Kale had rallied. Every corridor, every hallway, became a battlefield, with Kale personally leading his team into the heart of the conflict. He was everywhere, his tactics were flawless, and his presence on the battlefield was a rallying cry for all those who fought beside him. Despite the overwhelming odds, Kale's strategies and his ability to adapt quickly turned the tide in favor of the Academy's defenders. Using guerrilla warfare tactics that mirrored his survival training on Raqqa, Kale's team slowly pushed back the Dominion forces, retaking one sector of the Academy at a time. By the time the final battle took place in the Academy's central command, Kale had become a symbol. A living legend, not just for his physical prowess, but for his ability to inspire and unite. In the climactic showdown, Kale faced the leader of the Silent Dominion, a shadowy figure known only as the Wraith. The two engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand combat, each knowing that the outcome of this battle would decide the fate of the Academy and possibly the galaxy itself. Kale fought with every ounce of his training, using his mind and his body in harmony. After what seemed like an eternity of combat, Kale emerged victorious, the Wraith falling at his feet. With the Wraith's death, the Silent Dominion lost its leadership, and their forces crumbled. The Academy was saved, but the scars of the attack remained. Kale's reputation soared even higher as the leader who had saved the very institution that had made him who he was. Yet, despite his victory, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The galaxy had become far more dangerous, and the true war was still out there, waiting. Chapter 8. A New Alliance. In the aftermath of the Dominion attack, Kale found himself at the center of a galaxy in turmoil. The Silent Dominion may have been defeated, but the fractured political landscape was now more vulnerable than ever. It was clear that new alliances would be needed to maintain the fragile peace. Kale's fame had spread across the galaxy, but he remained a Ragan, an outsider in the eyes of many. The great powers of the galaxy, humans, the Trian Syndicate, the Gyrich Collective, were each vying for control and influence, and the threat of more Dominion-like organizations lurking in the shadows was ever present. But Kale was a man of action. He was not content with merely defending what had been won. He knew that if the galaxy was to survive, it needed something more than just military might. It needed a new order, one that was built on unity, strategy, and survival. He called for a summit, a meeting of the greatest leaders, warriors, and tacticians of the galaxy. The first of its kind. Leaders who had once viewed Kale as nothing more than a Deathworlder cadet now sat at the same table with him. They had all witnessed his leadership, his brilliance. Kale, with the conviction that had driven him since his first steps at the Academy, called for an alliance. It wasn't just a military alliance, it was a coalition of the greatest minds in the galaxy, focused on ensuring the survival and prosperity of every sentient species. No longer would they allow their differences to divide them. No longer would they allow shadow organizations like the Silent Dominion to play them against one another. The summit was tense, but by the end of it, Kale had achieved what many had thought impossible. He forged the Unity Accord, an interstellar coalition that promised mutual defense, trade cooperation, and collective scientific research. It was the beginning of a new era for the galaxy, and Kale's name was now known not just as a soldier or tactician, but as a visionary leader. Chapter 9: The Forgotten War. Kale had expected peace to follow the Unity Accord, but peace was elusive. As Kale traveled across the galaxy, overseeing the implementation of the Accord's terms, a new threat emerged. It came not from an external enemy, but from within the galaxy itself: civil unrest, economic instability, and resistance from factions who still refused to accept the new order. The galaxy's many species were not always united by the idealism that Kale had championed. Powerful corporations, warlords, and even entire systems turned against the Unity Accord, believing that Kale and his allies had gone too far. Kale soon found himself not just leading battles, but navigating a complex web of political intrigue and warfare. While the battlefields of space raged, Kale's skills as a tactician were put to the test in a different way. His mission was no longer to fight an external enemy, but to hold the galaxy together, to prevent its collapse into total chaos. The struggle for unity became a war of ideas, a war of ideals. In secret meetings with political leaders and military commanders, Kale worked tirelessly to maintain the peace. He knew that true victory could never be won with force alone. It would require the hearts and minds of the galaxy's people. Through his actions and words, Kale began to unite those who had once fought against him. Slowly but surely, they began to realize that Kale was not the tyrant they had feared. He was a visionary, a Deathworlder who had risen from the ashes of his homeworld to lead the galaxy toward something better. The galaxy had its legends, but Kale T-Rex was the one who would shape its future. And in that future, there would be no more shadows to hide in, no more factions to tear it apart. The legend of the Deathworlder Cadet was just beginning. Chapter 10: The Legacy of Kale T-Rex. Years passed, and Kale's legend became something more than just stories told in hushed tones around campfires. The Unity Accord flourished, and the galaxy entered a new age of cooperation and exploration. Kale had become a symbol not of military might, but of hope and unity. The galaxy, once divided by countless factions, was now held together by the bonds of a single, shared vision. Kale T-Rex may have come from a world of brutal survival, but he had proven that even the harshest conditions could forge the greatest leaders. And though he had saved the galaxy from countless threats, he knew that the true battle was one that would never end: the battle for peace. And so, Kale T-Rex, the Deathworlder Cadet who had risen from the storms of Robert to become a legend, watched over the stars knowing that the legacy of his journey would guide the galaxy toward a future brighter than the darkest corners of space. Chapter 11: Echoes of the Past. Years had passed since the formation of the Unity Accord, and the galaxy had settled into a fragile, but peaceful, balance. The factions that once fought for dominance had found common ground, and cooperation was slowly replacing conflict. However, as Kale stood atop the balcony of his flagship, overseeing the stars stretching before him, he felt the weight of something forgotten, something ancient. The galaxy was not as secure as it seemed. A message had arrived, cryptic and disjointed, from a source no one could trace. The only clear part of the transmission was a name: the Voidborn. The message mentioned a threat older than the current galactic order, an ancient race of beings who had existed long before the first stars had been born. These entities were said to be beyond the reach of technology, immune to the methods of warfare Kale had mastered. Their existence was a myth, a shadow in the historical records that no one had ever believed. But now, there was a flicker in the stars, a distortion that couldn't be explained. What Kale didn't realize was that the Voidborn were no longer just a myth. They had returned, and they were coming for the galaxy. Kale's mind turned immediately to strategy. He knew the stakes had changed, and if this ancient threat was real, it would challenge everything he had built. The time for unity had not yet passed, but the galaxy would need something more than military might to survive this unknown terror. The Unity Accord was tested once again not by the old enemies or internal dissenters, but by the shadows of a forgotten history. Chapter 12: The Awakening. Kale convened an emergency summit with the leaders of the Unity Accord, many of whom had never faced a threat like the one described. The Voidborn, as the transmission had indicated, were not beings of flesh and blood. They were something far older, something far more terrifying. The scholars and tacticians from every corner of the galaxy struggled to understand what this meant. These beings existed outside of the physical laws that governed life. They were whispers of the dark matter, echoes of the unknown. But one thing was clear: the Voidborn had awakened from their slumber in the deep recesses of the galaxy. As the council debated, Kale's mind raced, recalling ancient texts, fragments of lore from various species that had once encountered these entities. They were not conquerors. They did not seek to rule. They sought to erase life, civilizations, stars. Entire worlds had disappeared, swallowed whole in the Voidborn's wake, without so much as a trace. The members of the Unity Accord were divided. Some argued that the galaxy should immediately prepare for war, using the finest fleet and weapons in their arsenal. Others suggested that peace might be possible if the Voidborn could be reasoned with, though Kale knew that such a thought was naive. The Voidborn didn't communicate, they consumed. It wasn't long before the first attack occurred. A fleet of unknown origin, not quite ships and yet something more, emerged from the dark folds of space. These were not the Voidborn themselves, but their heralds, beings who were little more than extensions of the Voidborn will. The first system to fall was a heavily populated trade hub near the galactic core. Entire colonies disappeared overnight. No one knew why. No one knew how. It was as if reality itself had been altered. The survivors who managed to escape spoke of a force, an impenetrable darkness, erasing everything in its path. Kale knew that if the galaxy were to survive, they needed to understand their enemy. A direct assault on the Voidborn would be suicide. The very nature of their power rendered conventional tactics meaningless. There had to be a different way. Chapter 13: Into the Abyss. Kale took it upon himself to lead an expedition into the heart of the galaxy's darkest reaches, the area from which the Voidborn had emerged. He assembled a team of the galaxy's best explorers, scientists, and strategists, including some of the most trusted officers from his past campaigns. Among them was Dr. Saris Lurel, a renowned xenologist, and Ren, an elite Shirek operative who had once served as one of Kale's most formidable allies during the Silent Dominion crisis. Their mission was simple but nearly impossible: find the source of the Voidborn's power, uncover its true nature, and find a way to stop it. They journeyed deep into uncharted space, past the fringes of known civilization, where the stars themselves seemed to disappear. In the heart of the void, they found something that defied all logic. An ancient, colossal structure, an artifact older than any species alive, floating in the emptiness of space. It radiated an energy unlike anything they had ever encountered. The closer they drew, the more distorted time and space became. Dr. Lurel was the first to realize what they had found: a gateway, a rift in the very fabric of the universe, created by the Voidborn to traverse between realms. This isn't just a ship or a station, Doctor," Lurel said, her voice trembling. "This is an anchor. The Voidborn are not merely visitors from the distant galaxy, they are from beyond it. They don't just travel through space, they travel through dimensions." The revelation was staggering. The Voidborn were not of this universe. They were trans-dimensional beings, using rifts in the fabric of reality to travel between worlds, and their true form was incomprehensible to the human mind. They existed in the spaces between stars, between dimensions, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with. "We have to destroy this," Cale said firmly, his mind already working on a plan. They couldn't allow this gateway to remain open. But as they approached the gateway, something else emerged from the darkness: a fleet of Voidborn ships, sleek and black, their shapes undefined by any known physics. Their appearance was both terrifying and mesmerizing, radiating a dark, almost hypnotic energy. "Retreat," Cale ordered, but it was too late. The Voidborn responded not with weapons, but with an immense pulse of energy. The rift began to widen, and the stars themselves seemed to tremble. Space itself bent, pulling them toward the darkness, erasing their presence from the universe. Cale, ever the tactician, understood the situation immediately. They had no choice but to destroy the rift, even if it meant their lives. With a final coordinated effort, Cale and his team activated the self-destruct mechanism on their ship, sending a blast of energy into the rift. The force of the explosion was overwhelming, and as it detonated, the rift collapsed, severing the Voidborn's connection to their dimension. But not before a single entity, a being of incomprehensible form and power, emerged from the rift. It was a creature of pure energy, dark and swirling, and as it descended on them, Cale knew that this battle would be his greatest yet. Chapter 14, The Last Stand. Cale's team fought valiantly against the Voidborn entity, but the battle was unlike anything they had ever faced. The creature's presence warped the very air around them, and its mind, if it could be called such, was a thing of chaos and destruction. As the creature closed in, Cale's instincts kicked into overdrive. He knew that brute force wouldn't work against it. He wasn't dealing with an opponent he could outfight. Instead, he focused on its vulnerability, a flaw he had spotted in the rift's energy signature. With a combination of sheer force and calculated precision, Cale targeted the core of the Voidborn entity's energy source, a weak point that had been revealed during the rift's collapse. His plan was reckless, but it was the only option they had. With a final, desperate push, Cale used every last bit of energy to destabilize the creature's core, causing it to implode. The resulting explosion was a blinding, universe-shattering event. For a moment, Cale thought he might not survive, but then, as the light dimmed, he found himself floating in the silence of space, his body battered but alive. The galaxy had been saved, at least for now. The Voidborn had been repelled, and their gateway destroyed. But as Cale looked out into the stars, he knew the cost of their survival. Peace was never permanent in the galaxy, and threats like the Voidborn would always lurk in the shadows, waiting. Still, Cale T-Rex stood resolute, his legend continuing to grow. He had faced the unimaginable, and against all odds, he had triumphed. His name would be remembered as the one who saved the galaxy from the darkness of the Voidborn. But Cale knew that the true legacy was not just about defeating enemies, it was about ensuring that the light of hope would always shine in the deepest corners of the galaxy. And so, Kale's journey continued, not as a soldier of war, but as a guardian of the galaxy, a legend that would never fade, as long as the stars burned above. Chapter 15. A New Dawn. The galaxy had been through much. The battle against the Voidborn, the fractures within the Unity Accord, and countless trials had tested every alliance, every species, every leader. Yet, as Kale T-Rex returned to the heart of the Galactic Academy, he knew the time had come for a new chapter. The Unity Accord had endured, and Kale had seen to it that the galaxy's future would not be written in the blood of its people. It would be written in the actions of those who dared to challenge the darkness not with weapons alone, but with courage, wisdom, and unity. Kale stood before the gathered leaders of the galaxy, the very people who had once doubted him. They had all learned a harsh truth that no matter how powerful the galaxy had become, there would always be new challenges, new threats, and new mysteries to face. But in that moment, Kale could feel the weight of history. The legend of Kale T-Rex had transcended time. It was no longer just the story of a Deathworlder cadet who had risen from the ashes of his home. It was the story of the galaxy itself, of how hope had endured, of how the bonds of unity had triumphed over the forces of darkness. And as Kale gazed out at the stars, he knew the journey was far from over. The galaxy had entered a new dawn. The legend would continue, as long as there were those who fought for peace in the ever-expanding universe. And Kale T-Rex would be there, leading them. Chapter 16. The Final Horizon. Years had passed since Kale's victory over the Voidborn and the rebirth of peace within the galaxy. The Unity Accord had not only endured but thrived, forging a new age of cooperation between species and civilizations once torn by war and distrust. Kale, now a living legend, had guided the galaxy into this era, but he knew the true nature of peace. It was always fragile. The forces that had once threatened to tear the galaxy apart still existed, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Kale had seen it in the eyes of the young cadets at the academy, the same fire that had burned in his heart when he first entered those hallowed halls. They were the future, and though the galaxy was at peace for now, Kale could not shake the feeling that the lessons of the past were not yet fully learned. The galaxy had become a shining beacon of hope, but darkness always finds a way to creep in. In the years since the defeat of the Voidborn, Kale had become not just a legend, but a symbol. He had retired from active combat, choosing instead to focus on the education and training of the next generation of leaders at the Galactic Academy. His wisdom and experience were passed on to those who followed him, shaping their minds and strategies. Yet, as the sun rose over the galactic capital on the day of his final speech, Kale knew that he could not remain a figurehead forever. It was time to step aside. It was time to let the future take its own course. Chapter 17. The Last Stand of a Legend. Kale stood in the Academy's Great Hall, now a place where cadets from all corners of the galaxy gathered to hear the words of the very man who had helped forge their futures. As he gazed out at the sea of young faces, Kale felt a profound sense of pride. These were the heirs to the galaxy's legacy, soldiers, diplomats, and thinkers who would carry the torch he had lit all those years ago. He had spoken of unity, of cooperation, of peace. But there was something he had never told them, a truth he had kept buried deep within himself. The darkness was still out there. In the deepest parts of the galaxy, there were remnants of the forces that had once sought to destroy it all, the Dominion, the rogue factions, and yes, even remnants of the Voidborn, who had not been fully eradicated. Kale knew that the galaxy's peace was not eternal. There would be challenges, greater and more dangerous ones than any they had faced before. and there would always be those who sought to undo what he had built. His speech was brief, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. You, the next generation, will face challenges that we cannot predict. You will see horrors that will test your resolve. But you must never forget what we have built here. What we have fought for. This galaxy, though vast and diverse, is our home. It belongs to all of us. Never allow the darkness to divide us. As Kale finished speaking, he turned and walked off the stage for the last time. He had done everything he could. Now, it was their turn to carry the torch. But the galaxy was not a peaceful place. The call for action would come again, sooner or later. And when it did, Kale knew that he would be ready no matter where it led. Chapter 18, Legacy of the Deathworlder. As the years passed, Kale withdrew further into the quietude of retirement, though his name would never be forgotten. Statues were erected in his honor, books were written about his exploits, and every cadet who graduated from the academy was taught his name and his lessons. But for Kale, the true legacy was not in the accolades or the monuments. It was in the faces of the young warriors, diplomats, and scientists who left the academy, knowing that they were ready to face the unknown. It was in the knowledge that peace could be forged, but it was always fragile, something that had to be fought for every day. Though the galaxy remained peaceful for many years, Kale knew that darkness never rested. He had already begun preparing the new generation for challenges beyond anything he had faced. He had taught them the value of unity, but more importantly, he had taught them the strength of the will to protect that unity at all costs. One day, in the quiet of his private quarters, Kale stood before a holographic map of the galaxy, the stars flickering in the distance. He thought about his long journey from the brutal world of Raga to the halls of the Galactic Academy, to the day he became the galaxy's most revered legend. And now, here he was, on the cusp of stepping away from it all. Yet, as he traced his finger across the map, he knew that his work was not truly done. Peace was a fragile thing, and the galaxy was vast. Somewhere, in the infinite reaches of space, new threats would rise, new conflicts would emerge, and new heroes would be needed. But as long as there were those who remembered his name, Kale T-Rex, the Deathworlder who became a legend, the flame of hope would never go out. In that final moment, Kale knew his legacy would live on not in monuments or accolades, but in the hearts and minds of those who had learned from him. The fight for peace would always continue, but Kale had done his part. The galaxy was theirs now, and Kale T-Rex could rest, knowing that he had given it his all. Epilogue. A star among stars. The stars above shined bright, as they always had, and Kale T-Rex's name became a whisper on the wind, a tale of hope passed down through generations. No one would forget the Deathworlder cadet who had risen from nothing to become the beacon of peace, the leader who had shaped the future of the galaxy itself. But in the deepest silence of space, Kale's spirit remained. For he was not just a legend. He was the spark that had ignited a future brighter than any single star could ever burn. And somewhere, in the vastness of the galaxy, the next challenge was waiting. And the next legend would rise.